A very good evening and welcome to Biz First in Focus. Where is the Eurozone crisis heading? How is it going to affect the subcontinent, especially countries like Sri Lanka? To talk all this and more, we have with us this evening the Chief Economist for the South Asian region of the World Bank, Ms. Kalpana Koch. A very good evening and welcome to Biz First in Focus.
Thank you very much.
Starting off, ma'am, you've been at the World Bank for nearly 1.5 years, 23 years at the International Monetary Fund. Tell me, what is the distinctive differences you see at the IMF and also the World Bank?
Yeah. As you know, the two institutions were created at the same time, right at after the Second World War, by a conference that took place in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The World Bank is called actually the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. As the name suggests, the World Bank does much more project lending for bridges, roads, infrastructure, health, education, etc. The International Monetary Fund lends basically for balance of payments support, and the International Monetary Fund was set up to have to oversee the world monetary system. So the two perform different but complementary functions.
Ma'am, these Bretton Woods institutions that you're talking about, the IMF and also the World Bank, one of the allegations leveled at these institutions is the fact that they bring in policies as conditions. If you do not do this, the World Bank or the IMF would not support the respective governments concerned. Now, this really affects the developing world largely. How do you view this, ma'am? You've been at the World Bank 1.5 years and 23 years at the IMF. I want to know, how does this really impact?
Yeah, that's a good question. The IMF, and you have to understand the funding of these two institutions. The IMF and the World Bank, particularly the IMF, are funded primarily through quota subscriptions. So if you think about a country like the US, all the member countries, they pay in a quota subscription to the IMF. The size of the quota is determined by the size of the economy. So not surprisingly, the US is the largest quota subscriber. And these quota subscriptions is basically the capital base for the IMF. So when the IMF lends money, let's say to Sri Lanka or to India in the 1990s, it needs to assure that it can be repaid, because this money is a rotating pool of funds. It goes out to countries that need it, gets repaid, and then it's loaned to another country that might need it. So in order to ensure that the country's economic health is restored so that the IMF can be repaid, we have to have a program of policies which we agree with the government that they will implement, and then the disbursements are made as the policies are implemented. So it's really to put the fiscal and the financial health of the borrowing country back in order. And that's the reason that we have to impose some conditions. I want to emphasize that these reforms are usually agreed with the government. They may seem like conditions being imposed from the outside, but these are policies that are discussed and agreed by the government.
So you mean to say at a given point, if the government, the respective government concerned does not agree with the policies of the IMF or the World Bank, the lending would not take place as suggested or as agreed by both parties?
Well,
am I right?
Yes, technically you're right, but I mean it is a process of negotiation. We sit down with the government and say, this is your problem right now. Let's say you're running into a problem where your exports are falling far short of imports and you're running out of foreign exchange reserves. Let's hypothetically. Then you would sit down and say, what is the cause for this happening? Why is this happening? What policies can you implement to reverse the situation? So it's a partly policy adjustment and partly financing that that makes up this program. And so, yeah, it is a negotiation, and it has to come up with policies that are finally agreed. It is a letter of agreement that is signed by the government. It's kind of, so I just want to disabuse the idea that this is somehow imposed fully from the outside.
Ma'am, you're here in the island not for the first time, obviously. I spoke to you earlier as well. I want to know, why are you here in the island this time around?
I'm here at the invitation of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce for the Sri Lanka Economic Summit to give the keynote speech this evening, where I will be discussing, as you said at the opening, the Euro crisis, what's happening in the US, and then how it's impacting the developing world, and in particular Sri Lanka.
You're the Chief Economist for the South Asian region for the World Bank. How do you view the subcontinent, the economies of the subcontinent at present?
Yeah. Let me just take one step back and talk about what happened in the 2008 Lehman crisis. You see this, I see this, what's happening now as having begun in 2008 with the collapse of Lehman Brothers, and a series of shocks that has happened since then. In 2008, the South Asian countries were well positioned. They were coming off strong growth. In Sri Lanka is a slightly different story because the war was still going on at the time, but the rest of the continent, the rest of the region was coming off very strong growth, and so when the crisis hit, they were able to, they had policy room, they were able to increase government spending, lower interest rates, and help cushion the shock on their economies. Since then, I believe there's much less room. Many of these governments have been running large fiscal deficits. They have major structural problems. They have power shortages in India, Nepal, Pakistan, of course not so much in Sri Lanka and Bhutan, but they have, I think, they're in a much weaker position to respond to another shock if it were to occur, and there is actually a tremendous weakness in the global economy. But say another shock which people talk about, one country maybe exiting the euro and so on and so forth. These economies are much less well positioned than they were in 2008 because they've run large fiscal imbalances and have run up large government debt.
Countries like Sri Lanka, ma'am, what lessons can we really learn from Europe, from the crisis that plagued the world in 2008? What lessons can we really learn?
Several lessons. First, that you cannot run an economy based on excessive borrowing and excessive consumption. This is what these countries were doing. In the US, it was a run-up in housing prices. People were buying houses, first houses, second houses, third houses, with borrowed money, and prices were being driven up. But eventually, that wasn't sustainable. When prices collapsed, many homeowners were not able to repay their loans and so on. So first, consumption that's out of line with your borrowing capacity it would be wrong, and that applies also to governments. In Europe, it was a government problem. Governments were spending too much, collecting too little in revenues, and having way too much borrowing. So borrowing within limits, not too much, and to finance preferably investment rather than consumption. Second, you have to be vigilant about your financial system. How much of these loans are ending up in your financial system? Once the financial system, the banking system seizes and loses confidence, it's a very long recovery process. Those are the two things I think you really do need to recognize. Now, structurally, these countries, Greece, Portugal, Ireland, were not, they didn't have high productivity. So the lesson there is you need to have an economy that is very productive. So all the time you have to be looking for new ways to be productive.
We're now going for a short commercial break. When we come back, we'll talk extensively about the Eurozone crisis. Welcome back to Biz First in Focus. Ma'am, you're the chief economist of the South Asia region of the World Bank. I'm stressing on this fact. Why? Because I want to get answers from you. I want to know, was the euro an accident waiting to happen, the victim of a mugging, or a self-inflicted wound? How do you view the euro?
Let me explain that the euro area I think it's difficult to call it an optimal currency area. The euro was adopted in 1999 because politically these countries decided that they were going to form a union and adopt the same currency. However, when countries adopt the same currency, one fundamental fact has to be observed. That is, these countries have got to remain competitive. To remain competitive, there will be some countries that are more productive, let's say Germany, and some countries that are less productive that need to catch up to Germany. Otherwise, when you have a common exchange rate, the ones that are lagging in productivity will always be behind. That is exactly what occurred in the euro area. They formed a currency union, but did not put in place the other institutions and the other fiscal union and political union in a way to keep this currency union alive. And let me make a contrast. Say the US, you have 50 states, but they are part of a federal system. There's only one monetary policy, but there's also fiscal policy that can impact. So if one state runs a fiscal deficit in a way, or has a crisis or a shock of some kind, in a way the system is set up for other states to be able to help it. That wasn't the way that the euro area was set up. So in a way, it was set up in good times. When the euro was adopted in 1999, we had 10 years or so, or 8 years or so of very strong growth and good times. But the minute the Lehman crisis hit, you had a complete breakdown.
But everyone knew, ma'am, let me interrupt you there for a second. Everyone knew such a crisis is going to hit the euro. When the euro was formed in 1999, as they did mention before, everyone knew such a crisis is going to happen after a decade or so. So why a reactive approach and not proactive approach?
Yeah, you know, I'm not sure that you're right that everyone knew that a crisis was going to happen. And this was when they set up the euro. They had also adopted, as you know, the Maastricht Treaty, by which they were going to, all countries were going to have agreed to run fiscal deficits of no more than 3% of GDP, and so on and so forth. That never happened. That was not implemented or enforced strictly. So I don't think it was a foregone conclusion that the euro was going to run into a crisis. The problem was that
But when the Lehman Brothers issue really came up in 2008, there were sentiments about the euro collapsing.
No, immediately after the Lehman crisis.
So you agree with me when I said?
Well, not at the time of the adoption of the euro, but certainly the minute there was any strain in global financial markets, and the first sign of strain in global financial markets was the Lehman crisis. Yes, immediately you started to see strains in the euro area, which then, of course, because the world is so financially integrated now, what happened in the US quickly washed over to the shores of Europe, and now what's happening in Europe is also going to impact the US. It's a highly interconnected world, so it's not going to be possible to detach one from the other.
Take into account what's happening right now at euro. You see nearly 18 summits to save the euro over the last 8 months or so. I want to know, is it really worth saving the euro?